Welcome back to This Week in Immigration. I'm Jordan LaPier. On this week's program, stiff new rules for H-1B visas. ICE agents make arrests in a campaign targeting sanctuary jurisdictions. And the public charge rule comes back to life. All that's just ahead. Stick around. And here with me today, as always, are Theresa Cardinal Brown, Director of Immigration and Cross-Border Policy. She's on Twitter at BPC_T Brown. Hey, Theresa.
Hi, Jordan.
And Cris Ramón, Senior Immigration Policy Analyst on Twitter at CRamonBPC. Hey, Cris.
Hey, Jordan.
So thanks to you both for being here. All right, let's start here. Earlier this month, the Trump administration unveiled its newest proposed rules for the legal immigration system. The new rules target H-1B high-skilled visas and set more stringent eligibility requirements, new salary floors, and limit the visa's duration at certain work sites. The administration had previously issued new rules for international student visas that impose restrictions on how long international students can study in the U.S. before they need to renew their visas. So, Cris, what's the context here, and what's the history of these rules during the Trump administration?
Yeah, so I think the H-1B rules have actually a pretty extensive history with the administration. Back in late 2017, early 2018, I wrote actually my very first info brief at BPC about the unified regulatory agenda that the administration had put out. And that is essentially a document that outlines all the regulations that the administration wanted to implement. Among those was a little regulation that was looking at tightening the definition of what kind of positions could fall under the auspices of the H-1B program. And that was interesting because, we saw that, and we at the time were saying, well, this will restrict legal immigration. It will definitely tighten the H-1B program. But it never really went anywhere because obviously the administration was focusing on other things when it came to immigration, either what was happening at the U.S.-Mexico border or introducing other regulations like the public charge rule that we'll discuss later in this episode. So this came out of a little bit not unexpected, but certainly did not come out as soon as we would have thought, given the fact that the administration had made this a long-term priority. With the student rules, obviously this has been a persistent pattern that we've seen. Obviously, earlier this year during the summer, ICE unveiled a proposed rule that would have required students who could not do hybrid or in-class learning, they would have to go back to their home countries or they couldn't come to the United States. And so this is kind of interesting that they're introducing this new rule about the duration that they can stay in the United States. Right after they introduced this rule that received a lot of public blowback and actually led them to rescind it. So, when it comes down to the H-1B program, the administration has had that in its sights for a very long time, but it is something that, we're seeing the administration focus on as November comes along and, whether or not there will be a second Trump administration or not.
Theresa, walk us through these rules. What's noteworthy here to you?
Well, starting with the H-1B rule, it focuses a lot on defining what is considered a specialty occupation for the purposes of H-1B. The statutory definition of H-1B is a professional coming to work in a specialty occupation in the United States. And the regulations for the H-1B category have for a long time stated that a specialty occupation is one that requires a highly specialized body of knowledge. Practically, that has meant a job that requires a bachelor's degree in a specific field as the entry level for that occupation. And the H-1B worker would have to have that degree or its foreign equivalent or the equivalent in experience. In other words, they have to show that they gained that specialized body of knowledge. There have been a lot of policy issuances over the years, a lot of administrative appeals decisions that have further defined that level of required evidence to show that a job is a specialty occupation. And the new rules, which are proposed as interim final rules, so they are going into effect within 60 days of the date of issuance. They're not a proposal that would later be put in place, would tighten up those restrictions as to what counts as a specialty occupation and codify them in regulations for the first time. And that means that they will have a persistent effect through administrations unless a new set of regulations is proposed. So it definitely tightens that definition of a specialty occupation, requires additional proof of what is a specialty occupation. In addition, it places new restrictions on whenever a worker is working not at the place of employment of their employer, so a third-party work site. So think about a person who's working for a contractor on a contract and they work at a different employment location. Those kinds of employment for H-1B have been subject of a lot of scrutiny over the years. There's a lot of concern that those are not necessarily defining an employer-employee relationship when someone is contracted out to a third party. So the rules would restrict those kind of petitions to 1 year of validity only. Most H-1Bs are good for 3 years. So that would require more regular refiling, more regular proof that it's a true employer-employee relationship between the employer and that worker, and defining where they are working. And then the last set of rules actually came from the Department of Labor and apply not just to H-1B workers, but to all permanent employment-based petitions that require labor certification. And those rules are about how to define what is the prevailing wage for an occupation. Both H-1B workers and those sponsored for green cards under certain employment-based categories have to demonstrate that the worker is being paid the prevailing wage for the occupation in the area of employment. And prevailing wage rules have also been the subject of a lot of scrutiny over the last several years. In particular, how they are calculated by the government and how you account for things like tenure in a job. So more experienced workers in a job would obviously be paid more, but if somebody's coming in at the entry level, they may be paid in the lower end of a salary range in an area. But overall, the new prevailing wage calculations under this regulation would increase the amounts being paid to most H-1B workers and most green card applicants. So there's a lot of detail in here, but suffice it to say, it is tightening the requirements, it is elevating the level of pay, and we have to see how that plays out in terms of filings. But the most important thing is that these rules are being put in place as interim final rules, which means they will have immediate effect before people have a chance to comment on them. And the argument for putting them into effect immediately is that just like the executive orders restricting visas for people coming in from abroad, this is somehow protecting the jobs and wages of U.S. workers, although the regulation itself doesn't go into a lot of detail about exactly how that would work. With regard to the student rule, foreign students in the United States, as well as exchange students on J visas and certain other categories of non-immigrants, had usually been admitted to the United States for something called duration of status. Most visitors and non-immigrants coming into the United States are given a specific date when they enter by which they are supposed to leave. But foreign students, because their course of study could vary in length and time, depending on how well they pursue it and changes in the curricula, it's harder to define what a set date for them to complete their studies is. So they had been given something called duration of status, which meant that they were allowed to stay in the United States as long as they were continuing to pursue their course of study and the school had documented that they're fulfilling their obligations to have a full-time course of study. The new regulation actually would, for the first time, give a set date by which students had to either complete their work and study or apply for an extension. So now instead of saying, well, you're good as long as you're maintaining your status, they would have to actually file for extension if their course of study or their work afterwards went longer than whatever date they were given on arrival. That proposed rule would create another level of complexity and expense for foreign students studying in the United States. It is often the case that students who arrive may not complete, for example, an undergraduate degree in 4 years for a lot of different reasons. They may have to take a certain number of courses that other students wouldn't because what they bring with them from abroad doesn't have quite the same equivalence. They may have difficulty in studying and learning in English that sets them behind a little bit, but they're still making progress toward their course of study. This would require them to actually file for an extension of stay with USCIS, pay additional fees. Their visa that allows them to come and go and travel in and out of the United States during this period of time might also have to be extended, which requires another trip abroad and another amount of money. So it will definitely make studying in the United States more expensive, more complicated, and more convoluted, and increases the chances that if an extension of stay isn't granted in time, they wouldn't be able to start their courses in time, or they could accidentally fall out of status.
Theresa, I want to stick with you, but I'd like to get you both to weigh in on this one. What impact will these rules have on the broader legal immigration system? Will this put additional pressure on other streams of visa eligibility?
So it's interesting to note that we have two regulations applying to both foreign students and H-1Bs and green cards all within the state of a month. And it's important because an awful lot of people who eventually end up getting green cards to stay in the United States based on employment start as foreign students, then go to H-1B, and then apply for the green card. So having these regulations, all three of these regulations come out within a month, is clear to me that the administration is trying to clamp down on that pathway for foreign nationals to get green cards in the United States. Ken Cuccinelli, when the H-1B rule was issued by DHS, said that he thought it would mean that H-1B applications would decline by a third. There's no real data to support that necessarily. We always see every year 2 to 3 times the numbers of petitions filed for H-1Bs as H-1B visas are allotted each year. So even if a certain number of them are no longer valid under the new criteria, it's by no means certain that there aren't others out there that would continue to file. The other thing to understand is that it would actually increase the number of petitions filed on a regular basis when you restrict to 1 year those third-party placements. USCIS will actually probably see an uptick in the number of applications filed each year. And then last but not least, it's not at all clear. The larger companies that file and get most of the H-1Bs probably won't see a big impact from the prevailing wage. They're big enough that they can absorb those costs, and they still say they need these workers. They'll continue to file. But smaller and startup companies could be at a more significant disadvantage than they already are, because they may need only 1, maybe 2 workers. They may not be able to absorb the additional wage costs, but these are key workers for their companies that if they're not able to get them, could have issues continuing. So I think those are some of the impacts that I see from these regulations.
Yeah, I think the key thing for me is I think we're going to see a change in the composition of the individuals that are getting H-1Bs. I don't think we're going to have a major dent in the ability of the government's ability to, reach that H-1B cap. I mean, the demand for that program is so high that I don't think that will change the numbers overall of people getting H-1Bs, but it'll change the composition. There's the question for students, of course, is whether when you're making it so expensive for a student to study in the United States, at what point do they start looking at other countries like Canada and start thinking this is actually a little bit more inexpensive? It may not have the pedigree that a U.S. degree might have, but it will be significantly cheaper. And what's interesting is that countries like Canada have actually tried to really facilitate the entryway from being a student to becoming eventually a permanent resident. They've been trying to focus and reinforce that pipeline. And the country is also trying to reinforce its pipeline, at least for high-skilled immigrants who enter on a temporary visa, to be able to go and become a permanent resident in that country. And so it's not only going to impact legal immigration to the United States, and these policies might reinforce a trend that we're already starting to see, which is that more individuals are going to other countries, developed countries to study and work. So that means the long-term question the United States needs to contend with really is, how do these policies serve us in the national interest, whether it's our own economic national interest or demographic national interest in trying to keep up a working age population That's really one of the big takeaways from these policies, taken in as a whole. So that's the thing I think we need to reflect on. Like I said, as November's coming up, and we'll be thinking about whether or not these policies will continue under a Trump administration or might be reversed under a Biden one.
Okay, when we come back, ICE launches a campaign of arrests in sanctuary jurisdictions. On October 7th, DHS announced that ICE agents had arrested 128 people in California during a 5-day campaign targeting so-called sanctuary jurisdictions. The announcement followed a DHS initiative where the agency paid for billboards in the Philadelphia area with the mugshots of immigrants with criminal records wanted for deportation. These actions raise questions about whether the agency is playing a more active and political role as President Trump continues running on a law and order campaign before next month's presidential election. So, Cris, what's the context here?
So basically, what we've seen during the course of this administration has been emphasizing the purported nexus between immigrants and criminality. One of the earliest things that we saw with this administration is that one of the executive orders that President Trump signed at the beginning of his administration, I believe in spring 2017, what requested that reports on immigrant criminality be produced by the DOJ and DHS. And these two agencies put out, I believe, 2 reports on this issue. And aside from some of the spotty data that tried to say, the number of individuals in federal custody who are non-citizens, that this is evidence of them being criminals and the immigrants are criminals writ large, they also, the reports had these individual anecdotes about individual immigrants who committed, certainly heinous crimes. But none of it, is this wholly representative of the group? That's the question that sort of is raised when you're looking at this report. Is this individual that we're reading about, is that really representative of the whole group? That was certainly, I think, one of those questions that you had to reflect on as you were reading these reports. But I think, the point is that the administration has been sort of emphasizing this narrative, this rhetoric around immigration and criminality. And then at the same time, the administration has also been really active in targeting sanctuary jurisdictions or states, that limit cooperation between local law enforcement and ICE. The administration has, for instance, sued California for its sanctuary law, and they lost that lawsuit, has attempted to withdraw certain federal funds from localities that could not certify that they weren't trying to share information with ICE. So these 2 actions that the administration just took this month certainly has law precedent in the way that they've approached immigration and enforcement and immigration and immigrant criminality.
Theresa, what have been the outcomes from these actions apart from the obvious of the number of people arrested?
Well, I think it's worth noting that, there was a press conference with the acting secretary of DHS, Chad Wolf, and the head of ICE, Tony Pham, to tout this action in California and the arrest of 128 individuals. That's a lot of attention paid to an operation which, frankly, wasn't that huge by ICE standards. 128 people across the state of California in a 5-day campaign is not terribly significant when ICE has mounted nationwide campaigns that have seen 2 or 3 times that number of people arrested. But what is interesting is the amount of tension they're trying to put on it. And as Cris said, in the context of a years-long campaign against sanctuary jurisdictions, in particular against the state of California, this seems to be very much about public relations and trying to put pressure on the state of California and other jurisdictions to change their policies. The issue, though, is, however, that even if it's a relatively small number of individuals, and 128 is not none, and for them and their families, it's significant. But the issue is really that by announcing this, by making it such a public issue, the agency continues to spread concern in immigrant communities and raise fears. And that is part and parcel also of the point of the operations. The other thing is, I think that, we have this issue of the billboards around Philadelphia. And that is definitely a messaging campaign, because it's not your typical wanted posters that said, hey, we're looking for this person. Have you seen them? There's an explicit message on these billboards that, hey, it's the fault of your city's policies that this person is on the loose. So not only does it conflate the issues of criminality and immigration enforcement, but it is an active campaign by a federal government agency to get a locality to change its policies. And as Cris mentioned, the federal government so far has not been successful in federal courts in getting these local policies overturned. They can't even get the courts to agree that it's okay for them to withhold funding to get these jurisdictions. So what's left is to try to mount a public relations campaign in a political atmosphere to try to get these jurisdictions to change their policies. But there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of receptivity by the localities that have these jurisdictions. And in fact, the County of Los Angeles recently reached a $14 million settlement with people that it had held longer than the time they were supposed to be released on ICE detainers. So increasingly, jurisdictions are finding that not only are they implementing these policies because it helps them, they believe, with community policing in immigrant communities, but they're looking at legal and expensive liabilities for helping ICE with its enforcement activities.
Theresa, are you concerned? You worked at DHS during the Bush and Obama administrations. Are you concerned that DHS is taking on a more public and partisan role in the presidential campaign season this year?
I am concerned, and I think that one of the things that any country, any government at any level has to be concerned of, and in an atmosphere where we already have a lot of tension, if you will, between law enforcement in this country and the public that it is, whose safety it's responsible for, politicizing local regulations and local decisions at a national level creates distrust, creates conflict between organizations and agencies that you would like to try to work together for the overall safety of the public. It creates distrust by the public. It creates conflict. There are areas that have nothing to do with immigration enforcement that ICE also works on. Things like child sex trafficking and pornography and drug-related issues that, of course, local jurisdictions would like to cooperate with them on. But having this immigration issue be front and center and creating barriers hurts the things that could really move forward. So I think it's a danger whenever you have a law enforcement agency become overly politicized like this, especially on an issue that is frankly becoming more divisive in this country and not less divisive, and that's immigration.
All right, let's leave that there. After the break, the gavel. Finally today, it's the gavel. The Trump administration recently re-implemented the public charge rule after receiving the green light from the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. That court's decision marks the latest battle over the rule's implementation, which had seen federal courts issue and lift injunctions against the rule. The decision comes at a critical time when many potential green card applicants weigh the possibility of accessing the limited number of public benefits as the current economic recession continues. Theresa, walk me through what the court ruled here.
So the court history of this public charge rule is long and convoluted, so I want to go back to the beginning. So in 2019, the Department of Homeland Security finalized this rule from USCIS on public charge that created a significant new and fairly stringent test that potential immigrants and non-immigrants would have to pass in order to show that they would not, quote unquote, become a public charge. Many groups sued. There were injunctions that were put in place preventing the rule from going into place. The case ultimately made its way to the Supreme Court in January 2020, and they lifted one injunction, although another injunction out of New York remained in place. And But another set of filings was made in February of 2020 because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And another injunction was issued by the U.S. District Court in the Southern District of New York in July of this year. However, at the end, in the middle of September, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals overturned that injunction, allowing USCIS to fully implement the public charge rule, which they intended to do as of the end of September. So for everyone filing for an immigrant visa overseas, for adjustment of status in the United States, anyone asking for a non-immigrant visa or a change of status to a non-immigrant visa would have to meet these new, more stringent public charge rules.
And Cris, how will this ruling impact immigrants during this current economic downturn?
I think the key question that needs to be asked is whether or not this will deter potential green card applicants from trying to seek public benefits that they may be able to access. As you noted up at the top, the number of public benefits that are available for, particularly for individuals who are here on a legal status and who may be on the road to getting a green card is pretty limited. But the issue with the public charge rule is that because it's such a complex rule, because there's so many components to it, that one of the things that we did see was the sense that immigrants weren't really sure what would count or what not would count against their ability to access a green card because of this rule. And I think that this is only going to continue to perpetuate that confusion. But especially as you're facing situations where this pandemic has now been going on for at least 6 months, and certainly people are feeling the financial pinch because of the economic downturn. So I think the question really is going to be whether or not this is going to mean more families are going to try to forego some benefits that they think they can't access, but they may be able to, and that they may be putting themselves in an increasingly riskier position. So I think that's the primary question and the primary concern. And this is something that, I think advocates, when they were reading the rule, were particularly worried about. So, back when they were, basically criticizing the rule's arrival, I don't think anybody had really anticipated that we would be dealing with a pandemic. I don't think anybody anticipated the pandemic at all, to be frank. But I think that this is a situation that I think really reflects the potential downsides of trying to really put together a rule that is very complex and difficult to understand, and then expecting people to sort of abide by it without really full, clear understanding of what counts, what doesn't count, and what they can access and can access in situations like these.
And I just want to add, to wrap it back up to something we said at the top of the program, this will mean that more potential immigrants and non-immigrants are denied and on the basis of this rule. And it's a further evidence of, by regulation, the administration restricting immigration to the United States. A report just came out the other day or two from the Cato Institute that said that in the second half of this fiscal year, new immigration in the United States is down 92% to some of the lowest rates we've seen since World War II. And that can have long-term impacts on the country, because immigrants do supplement our workforce. They do add growth to the economy. And if we have a prolonged period of decreased immigration, it will have impacts on the ability of the economy to recover.
All right, that's a good place to leave it for today. Theresa, Cris, thanks so much for joining me. And thanks to you all for listening. We will be back as always in 2 weeks. Before we go, a quick reminder: subscribe, rate, and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or your favorite podcast platform. And if you give us a 5-star rating, that'd be great. You can also find more information on all the issues we discuss here on the show at bipartisanpolicy.org/immigration. This Week in Immigration was created by Theresa Cardinal Brown and myself. The executive producer of This Week in Immigration is Theresa Cardinal Brown. This week's episode was written by Cris Ramón and myself. Our producers are Cris Ramón and Yafet Tawahada, and our editor is Yafet Tawahada. The executive producer of BPC Podcasts is Ashley Swearingen. I'm Jordan LaPier. Join us again next time on This Week in Immigration.